the round.
Hi, am I audible? All right, wonderful.
Yes, audible.
Thank you. Could I ask people to turn off the camera? Because unfortunately, I am just on data. Yes, thank you so much. I'll take POIs through chat. I mean, you can interrupt me if you want, but that'd be very mean because I don't like that. Yeah, all right. And lastly, my pronouns are she, her. Few points of setup that I want to note. Number one, we think that as of right now, Pakistan likely owes a lot, like a substantial amount of money to other external actors. But number two, given the wording of the motion, we can suggest that as of right now, the Pakistan has already likely received a lot of like existing IMF bailouts already. Given that the the proposal coming to you from opposition is to like prioritize receiving further bailouts. When we talk about what debt restructuring is, it's quite simple. It means we want to maintain existing debt that Pakistan holds, but it also means we want to spread these things over a longer period of time, right? So it looks like we want to push for things like lower coupon payments or renegotiating certain interest rates on existing debt. We think that because of because of by construction, the ways that restructuring works means that they ought to restructure these things in ways that are likely going to be significantly more manageable for Pakistan to pay. So it looks like lower coupon payments that are just easier for them to pay on a year-on-year basis. Opposition has to then defend just additional IMF bailouts and why these are better. First argument then, why you're likely going to have just generally better terms in the process of trying to pay out these financial loans, a few things. Number one, let's recognize the context of the motion. In the context of the debate, you've already been the recipient of many IMF bailouts. What this means is, number one, you are likely already unpopular within the context of the IMF because you've already showcased an inability to pay back these debts or an inability to pay back these bailouts. But secondly, on opposition, you need to request, it's much harder for you you need to request like additional bailouts and additional loans from the IMF. What's the problem with this? The problem with this is that because you already have a long history of borrowing, it means they have significant leverage over you, which means they can enforce a lot of other conditions the point at which you request for other bailouts. This can look like things like opening up or liberalizing your economy, things like giving them preferential treatment for member states. So it means the point at which you want to trade with other things like Western states, you're more likely to be subject to things like greater loss because you have to give them things like better deals, right? The reason why they're likely to do this is because of the fact that you already have a long history of taking these bailouts out. They are more likely to impose these conditions as a way for you to secure additional bailouts. The reason why this is bad is two things. Just number one, you're at a greater disadvantage in the long term because of the fact that these things can be imposed indefinitely. But secondly, you just have very, very little leverage to renegotiate these terms, meaning that your economy is much likely to perform significantly worse. It means your local economy and local producers are likely going to suffer, the point at which they're going to be making worse off deals or they have to compete with international actors. But thirdly, it also just means you're going to get less profit, the point at which you do trade with the Western actors. Before I move on to the comparative, let's take opening.
The exact same incentives apply for the other creditors. IMF is significantly better if these measures themselves are likely to be good for the economy of Pakistan.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the comparative then and why it's not true these harms are symmetric. And the reason for this is number one, the fact like by construction, the way that debt restructuring works, is to say that it has to be things or it has to be terms that are at the very least good or to some extent preferential for Pakistan. Because the point of the debt restructuring is that the goal is they want them to be able to pay back these loans. They want Pakistan to grow and make more money such that this money can be used to pay back their loans. So by construction, these things have to be manageable for Pakistan to do. But secondly, just in terms of leverage, and this is where I'm going to respond to the idea of leverage, because coming from OO's response or OO's POI, they tried to say that these other states likely have leverage over you as well. I think that the leverage that most of these loans usually happen on a bilateral agreement, which means the amount of leverage one state has over you is significantly different than the amount of leverage 30 states that are included or member states of the IMF are likely going to have. So even if there is some form of inequality in terms of leverage, we think that the leverage from a large abundance of Western states is much worse to manage and much harder to manage compared to the leverage of an individual state that you're trading with. So the conclusion of this is simple. Even if debt exists on our side, you're much more likely to pay this off. And the weighing is number one. If there are incentives to be bad on either side, the leverage on our side is significantly easier to mitigate. But secondly, we think these things are just generally more sustainable. So because debt restructuring has to be in ways that are preferential, or at the very least has to be in ways that are productive for Pakistan, it means you're less likely more likely to opt out of things like the infinite cycle of loaning. Versus on opposition, we think because IMF benefits from you constantly needing bailouts, you're more likely to enter into the cycle of bailouts, which leads to you like relying on their bailouts, asking for more loans, etc., etc. Second argument then in terms of investor confidence. And we think this is important because the prerequisite for you to be able to pay off your debts is to have a good debt to GDP ratio. And we think a lot of these things, especially in the context of developing countries, is highly reliant on your ability to attract things like foreign direct investment and things like just money that and capital that goes to the local economy. Why then do you get none of this when you work with the IMF? Two reasons. Number one, you asking for additional bailouts is a bad signaling mechanism to the entire international community because it signals that you are unable to pay off any debt at all. It means you're more likely to have a lack of confidence because of the fact that you're constantly asking for bailouts. People don't trust your ability to pay back any loans, therefore they won't loan to you or make any kind of investment. But secondly, the IMF just generally has a bad history and bad reputation in terms of their involvement with developing countries. So it means because they have a history of screwing over developing economies, it means even if you don't believe that my first argument does happen, the very fact that it has happened in the past to a variety of other countries means investors are incredibly risk averse. It means people are simply just unwilling to trust you, or you just generally look a lot less reliable the point in time you work with the IMF. Why then is this harmful? Number one, it leads to obvious capital flight, so companies and investors pull out. But number two, it affects your reputation with other neighboring states. So this looks like your ability to trade with nearby states like Turkmenistan or Uzbekistan. It means you are not seen as reliable. They will stop trading with you in order to limit things like the contagion effect. So they don't want to be seen as equally unreliable. They will start isolating you and stop trading with you, right? The comparative is quite simple. Number one, if on the worst extent, there is some form of a lack of investor confidence on either side, on our side, Pakistan looks like it's just significantly more agentic. So you look, the fact that you're making you're more proactive in creating, you're more proactive and involved in things such as debt restructuring. It means you're more likely to look in control, you look more proactive, and you look like you're making a larger change at trying to just make these loans and make your financial situation significantly better, right? But secondly, we think distance from the IMF is good and necessary for Pakistan at this moment. Why? Because of the fact that you've already taken far too many bailouts from the IMF. You already look, as of status quo, far too reliant on them because of the history of taking out bailouts. We think at the point in time you've already done this so many times, we think that it's necessary for Pakistan to create some form of distance to them such that they look a lot more reliable, such that investors are more likely to put money into them and help them with their development. The way for this is quite simple. Number one, just investors are the prerequisite to pay off any form of debt. But number two, we think this also affects other aspects of development. So obviously, investors are not just good for paying off debts, but investors are just generally good for being able to develop your local economies and strengthen a lot of these systems that exist within the country. Thank you.
Thank the Prime Minister for that great speech. I invite the leader of OP.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you.
I thank Hello for a great speech. I'll invite the PM.
Okay, hi. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. You're on speaker, so just raise your hand. I'll call you, but when I call you, please speak loudly. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1, and go. I know it's fun to dunk on China, but I definitely wouldn't be as unnuanced as this opening opposition team is. The first thing I'll do is independently weigh our second argument. This got 0 response, so if BLO does not address it, they automatically lose. We said that investors massively lose confidence in Pakistan at the point at which you go into an IMF bailout. Why? One, because there's a signaling mechanism that you yourself cannot pay, and therefore it is a bad image on you and your domestic economy specifically. Secondly, people do not like the IMF. Sure, maybe it was good for Greece, but historically it has been tragic for Africa, it has been tragic for Asia. So many different countries have fallen bear witness to how bad IMF loans are, how bad liberalization policies are in the IMF, and how bad they are even if they want to mask it in terms of benevolence or some sort of benevolent assimilation as opening opposition wants to claim. The fact is, long-term, the IMF is a devil on the shoulder, and that's why people generally want to avoid these things. What does this mean? It means that both private and country investors do not want to partner with US Pakistan. What did that mean and why was that debate winning? One, because if you have less people supporting your GDP, that is bad because the GDP is the prerequisite to solving literally any economic problem. If you have debt, the only way to solve that is you have GDP because debt is not inherently bad as long as you have an ability to pay that out. But secondly, if you want to talk about the kinds of terms they want to talk about on their side, when it comes about things like liberalizing companies that will simply like vet out all of their profits towards the West, if you don't have an ability to sustain your economy by your own domestic industries, this means that you are unable to prove that these terms are sustainable in the long term under their set of house. That is why it's independently winning. OO can't just get by without responding. Let's then talk about the chunk of the debate of opening opposition. The first thing I'll talk about is debt restructuring, justifying the comparative, and then secondly, I will, as LO says, trash on theirs. What do they say about debt restructuring? They just say that China is bad. I want to be very clear about how they build this. They just say that China has incentives to demand lots of money because they have things like the Evergrande crisis and because they want to maintain their very expensive military. I want to note the meta of this. This only proves incentive. It only proves that China wants to demand more money. It never engages the reasons we give as to why they can't actually have the capacity to demand more money. What did we say? Why do we have leverage? One, because the debtor has no alternatives to get the money. You obviously, as China, don't want to default. So if the person or the entity or the state with the debt says, well, I choose the debt restructure, I'm not going to be willing to do anything else, then obviously they have no alternatives and therefore they will have to succumb to this because the alternative is literally not getting your money back, which is why something is still better than nothing, even if you're an actor as bad as China, because the alternative is literally getting nothing, guys. The second thing is there's an optical incentive for debtors. Why is this important? Because opening opposition concedes that China currently is a little bit bad. The important thing here is there's a nuance with China. Currently, China has to handle BRICS. With BRICS, you have to convince that it's very, very good and more benevolent than other traditional actors like the Bretton Woods institutions, people like the IMF or the World Bank. That is literally the only way that BRICS is going to survive. And what that means is, given that China is the poster boy of BRICS, China is included here. That means that anything that is seen as predatory is disastrous for China and their own ambitions. The billions of dollars or yuan are being poured into this. And what that means is, obviously, they want to appear nice and actually give you good loans. But the third thing is, this neglects the numerical advantage. Clearly, if you're negotiating with one state, it's far easier because they have no alternatives or people to back them up versus the alternative that we explained. What that means is, clearly, the debt restructuring is going to be good. What is it going to look like? Clearly, it looks like things like being able to lower the coupon payments, stretch the debt over a longer period of time, such that even if we're able to explain that China has bad incentives and maybe the debt is still going to be large, at the very least what you can understand is the debt is still going to be stomachable up until the end of the debt because otherwise they won't get their money back. This defends the comparative. Secondly, on terms. What did they say? They said that they had COVID packages and long-term policies. Clearly, that's not nuanced. The main reason that they give here is, well, the West is benevolent. And, they generally are good historically with countries like Greece or whatever. The first thing I want to point out is that this only proves that they will give you the loan. It does, or give you the bailout rather. It does not prove the sustainability of the terms of that bailout or whether you're going to be able to fulfill the terms of that bailout far into the future. And note, it is exactly the rhetoric of opening opposition as to why they're able to get away with all of these things. They're able to say this is something that is good. We are the benevolent West. This is the best that you can get without actually being able to justify it, especially with all of the reasons we explained as to why IMF terms are simply shit. But secondly, they empirically have failed so many countries with their loans, guys. Like, this is just a lie. Like, it's a lie that people have been able to be bailed out by the IMF properly. Look at, for example, Turkmenistan. Look at, for example, Uzbekistan, who have received IMF loans. Historically, they have defaulted after because the IMF loans simply are not sustainable by the terms that they impose. What are the reasons as to why the IMF has very bad loans? These are the reasons that they got no response to. One, simply the numerical weight of you going 1 versus 30. But secondly, there's a reputational problem here, and this is very important. They say that they are benevolent. The West wants optics. The problem is, guys, you are not Greece. Historically, the IMF has been incredibly racist and incredibly biased towards people of the West Asian region. Why? Because of, for example, the war on terror, being able to say that people in this region is necessarily not that good compared to people who are geographically near, for example, the EU. Obviously, it's a very unfortunate reality, but that's the reality, guys. What that means is clearly the kinds of terms that they say are historically good are biased towards countries that they say are good. But thirdly, even if we prove that these terms are good right now, sure, that proves that you're able to have the bailout. It does not prove the long term that we explained is so important. Before I go on, CEO.
You're still negotiating and restructuring your debt with the IMF amongst many actors. Why would this racist, evil IMF not demand austerity and so many policy changes that you said the IMF has historically demanded out of these countries? They want their money back, right?
Okay, one, you have the knife you're opening here because clearly China is the one that's the biggest actor. If you want to debate the characterization, sure. But secondly, clearly, if we say that debt restructuring is the only option, that just proves that you're able to have it more you're able to stomach it, right? Because it's the extent of the amount that you're asking to be relieved. On our side of the house, sure, it might be big, right? But we explain at the very least that it's going to be stomachable, even if it's big, because it's spread over a long term. Versus your side, you have to accommodate for the entire amount of the bailout, which obviously is very immediate and very, very big. What is the weighing of this? One, it's the guarantee of sustainability. Even at worst, where the restructure is heavy and have to pay a lot, the fact of the matter is we guarantee that you're able to pay off the entire loan. But there's no long-term guarantee on their side when the terms are, for example, being able to make sure that you have, like a bunch of liberalized economies, when you have to make sure that people are imposing their own companies in them and them being able to repatriate those profits outwards. But secondly, it removes the agency of Pakistan. If the point is that nobody can predict the future, the fact that you are flooding their agency to be able to make sure that they can have their own economy to themselves and not to outward actors means that on their side of the house, you have no protection in the case in which you do need an initial bailout, in which you do need additional help. It is only under our side where we prove the sustainability, we prove why there's more confidence in the region. That's why you propose.
I thank BPM for that great speech by DLO. I thank the DLO for that great speech. This concludes the opening house. I will now invite member of the
Pakistan has a unique opportunity to stimulate its domestic economy and create an export base that can rival China that's currently being decoupled with for political reasons by most of the Western world. But it won't happen if the IMF bailout is further accepted. Why is that the case? Because whatever you say about the IMF, which I think is true that they have an incentive to reduce corruption, to stabilize your economy in the long run, especially, etc., they are still parts of the Washington consensus. Why is that the case? Because the ideological base of the IMF is still based in America. It is still run by people who are beholden to that consensus, who are still believers of trade liberalization and of specifically further trade liberalization, reducing barriers, increasing ability of foreign companies to invest, and decreasing the competitiveness of the domestic companies inside of their own country. I think that all of this is soft conceded by opening opposition at the point where they say that the main impact that they bring is that foreign investment can come in at an easier way. I think that this is true, but the vast majority of that investment isn't going to be investing in domestic companies because this is simply not profitable for most of the multinationals. It is likely looking like buying out the domestic companies, investing in setting up facilities by those multinationals and creating special economic zones within Pakistan, which are then competing for the same produce, for the same labor force, for the same resources that the domestic producers are. This is problematic for Pakistan for three reasons. Number one, because they are unlikely to be able to take advantage of the generational opportunity of one, having a lot of resources and having a lot of people in order to actually create export, and having the main competitor being disappeared both from the inside in terms of the Evergrande crisis and the fact that China is, not doing so well. I think we established this already. But two, the fact that politically speaking, it is being decoupled from by the US, by EU, which means that essentially this is a time-sensitive manner right now. We shouldn't be doing this further liberalization through the IMF right now, because right now the priorities are radically different. Let's explain then what specifically protectionism does in terms of helping you develop an industry that can go competitive in the long run. And why this is going to be impossible is going to be the further aspect of this case. Number one, because investment is going to be only possible at the point where you do not have strict regulations on how much money you can spend per year on specific parts of the economy. Specifically note that IMF is likely to restrict that because they want to control your cash flows. They want to make sure that you aren't going to be spending too much money because they don't want you to end up further in debt. At the point where you enslave yourself further to the IMF regulations, you're likely to cap your own ability to invest in those companies. Two, because you're able to actually invest this money in up and down the supply chain in a way that is actually smart and in a way that is actually beneficial. Why is that the case? One, because this is something that is hugely important for the economy of Pakistan, which means that civil society is likely to scrutinize that part of the economy very strongly. Panel, no, because this is a crucial mechanism. Why is that significant? Because it weighs out corruption to a significant degree. Because even if corruption exists, which yes, it does exist, at the point where this is something that is crucial for the economy and is widely recognized as such, the civil society that is present and strong within Pakistan is likely to control this to a significant degree. It's likely to question, it's likely to investigate. The media is likely to look into the specific comings and goings in those companies. This has two implications. Number one, that corruption coming in from opening opposition is significantly mitigated. But second, further mitigation to corruption. IMF has already been bailing out Pakistan many, many times. It has already implemented corruption stopping measures. The amount of corruption stopping would need to be proven to be marginally utile. What do I mean by that? Any further bailout needs to do something different. Sure, but why is the different thing that haven't been working so far, why is it magically going to start working now? The opening opposition case is a generic on why IMF good that doesn't consider that the IMF has already bailed out Pakistan many times, implemented the 8 packages, implemented the liberalization packages to some degree already many times, and it's unclear why in the hell this time is going to go any better. And I think that at the point where their generic doesn't address the context, it's unclear why they can win this debate, and specifically why you can beat our case on protectionism and on why domestic industries need to be stimulated. Uniquely, this can happen on the debt restructuring side. Why is the debt restructuring side going to uniquely be good on this? For two reasons. Number one, because we live in an post-inflationary pressures to deflate the currencies. What do I mean by that? I mean by that inflation is going down because of the supply chain shocks being mitigated significantly. Let's explain what inflation is actually, because I think that this is significant. Inflation is when you have an undersupply relative to the amount of things that people demand, and therefore the amount of money that you have to pay for each unit of supply increases because there is many more competitors for that item than just you. This is a crisis of undersupply. Why is supply increasing? One, alternatives to oil. This is specifically the case in America, but European states as well, where luxury and high technology items have been found, many new resources and many new materials have been found that can rival oil, despite the fact that oil price is still quite high because of the war in Ukraine, because of the fact that Russia is hugely sanctioned. Europe and America were able to develop a number of alternatives. For example, lithium-ion batteries and cars powered by this, which means that both on the logistical side, as well as on the side of both on the logistical side as well as on the side of production, you have alternatives to oil, which means that supply is going to go higher up, which means that prices go down, which means that, and this is significant, central banks can lower interest rates. Why is that the case? Because central banks want the economy to be as optimal and as stimulated as possible. At the point where they are able to reduce that, they are going to do this, partly because they are politically beholden still, and partly because they just have an incentive in making sure that the economy is operating at equilibrium. Implication, therefore, you're going to decrease the amount of money that you charge per amount of debt. This has two implications. Number one, you can get the debt restructured in a significantly better way, because all of those financial financial instruments that are held at specific rates that are tied to the central banks can now be held at lower interest rates that they were borrowed at, which means that you actually have an improvement in terms of the rate. But two, and this is going to be crucial in defeating OO, China has an incentive to give you the deal quite well. Before that, closing, what do you have?
You yourself, Pakistan has taken so many different IMF bailout. Why would the IMF agree to let you do protectionism right now for restructuring?
Yeah, sure. I think that they aren't, I think that the problem is that IMF can only attack reactively at the point where they are giving the bailout. They can change the policies, but they can't enforce those policies being going forward, which means that the past bailouts are unlikely to have the effect linger the way that you assert them to be. Also, I think that the case is going to be you owe money to the IMF, so just take the bailout because then they're going to have to renegotiate with you. I think that this can also be done under debt restructuring. I'm not sure why this is exclusive. I'm not sure why CO is within this debate if that is their case. Let's go into why China good. China specifically is dependent on long-term cash flows, not on short-term cash flows. Why is that the case? Because China is an autocracy that operates on extremely long time span. Note that the Chinese plan is operating not in 5 years, it's operating in 100 years, which means that China cares more about how much money total they're going to get rather than how much money they get in the short term. It's unclear why China has the same incentives that a democracy would in terms of getting cash strapped. That implies two things. Number one, that China benefits from giving you a debt restructuring that is very, very long term. For you, this is crucial because now you can spend that money on stimulating your domestic industry, and you're likely to do that because this is something that you have an incentive to. But China wants you to actually pay this in full, even if it takes them an enormous amount of time. They are happy to restructure this in that particular way. It's unclear why they are needed the cash, considering the fact that they don't have the political incentives to spend that cash right now. What have we proven to you? We have proven to you that this is necessary for Pakistani economy being good in the long term. We win this debate.
Whip.
Three parts to this speech. Firstly, explaining our extension and explaining why it wins the debate. Secondly, taking out closing. And lastly, taking out opening opposition. Firstly, on our extension. What we uniquely explain to you is what specifically the inability to engage in protectionist policies to build up Pakistan from the ground up does to the country. And the reason why this is the case is because the IMF has an incentive to control the cash flows of Pakistan, because it doesn't want Pakistan to keep coming back to it and asking for bailouts over and over again, meaning that it has the incentive in order to pacify those who have to fund the bailout, that is to say, those countries that form part of the IMF, that it's going to be different this time, that this time is going to be the one where this time is going to be the final bailout that Pakistan is getting. And for that reason, it's very likely to impose far, far more stringent conditions than it already ever has imposed. And part of the reason why Pakistan needs to keep coming back and getting a bailout is because of the stringency of those conditions, because of the fact that it hasn't been able to build up its own domestic businesses, and because of the fact that FDI has just flown in and suppressed its ability to invest money across the broad range of the supply chain rather than just concentrating it in the pockets of foreigners. And uniquely, we also explain the positive comparative on why debt restructuring is likely to be good. Because firstly, inflation is falling, meaning that central banks are able to offer at lower interest rates, meaning you can get better terms than you borrowed for. OG try and improve the incentive of China to ensure that there is the good terms of these loans. But what we prove through this analysis on inflation is the capacity, and we therefore take out opening opposition's analysis on why China just doesn't have the money to do this. But we also deal here with what CEO keep raising in their POIs about how there are multiple different creditors, because even if it isn't the case that China is the primary creditor, we also ensure that central banks everywhere are able to lower their interest rates and ensure that we get far better restructuring. But secondly, we explain why China is uniquely dependent on long-term cash flows, meaning that it's in the incentive of China to ensure that it's able to engage in this debt restructuring process because the alternative is so much worse for China. How do you weigh this extension as the most important in the debate? The first thing we do is we take out OG for a couple of reasons. The first thing to note is that they knife themselves significantly, because they say in a one-liner that businesses can be screwed over when the IMF comes and gives bailouts, but then they also want significant amount of FDI, and it's FDI that is likely to harm these smaller businesses that are crucial to growing Pakistan's economy from the ground up. But secondly, we also prove the positive comparative. We explain why the IMF doesn't let you do domestic investment, and we accept the OO characterization of the IMF. So secondly, then we take it over OO, because OO don't prove why the IMF is able to help these countries in any way other than it gets foreign direct investment. In uniquely flipping this impact and improving why the foreign direct investment itself is so harmful to Pakistan and keeps it in this cycle where it needs to keep receiving a bailout or getting debt restructuring, we prove why Pakistan is likely to be on the path to long-term development on our side. Secondly, then let's deal with closing opposition. They claim that Pakistan needs this money at the moment because of the fact that it has a balloon public sector, it's facing security threats, and it's in need of short-term flows of cash. There's a couple of responses I have to this. The first is that note that given that they didn't respond to our framing and our characterization, that their case is significantly undercut because they are probably on their side have to get rid of their significant public sector with a bailout because of these stringent conditions that are going to be imposed along with this bailout that require things like austerity, significantly cutting down your government budget. And this is also likely to constrain the amount of money that can go into the military, undermining Pakistan's ability to protect itself in the short term and thus taking them on their own metric. But secondly, if they want sustainability, as they claim in member, then bailouts are the wrong way to go about that, because at some point at least there is going to be a significant amount of fatigue on the part of the countries that have to fund these bailouts, the member countries of the IMF, and at some point Pakistan isn't going to be able to receive the bailouts from the IMF. At that point, it's probably worse when it has to renegotiate its loans with China at the point where it is increasingly and even more desperate than it is now, because China then knows that it has greater leverage over Pakistan than it might under the status quo. So we uniquely prove why now is the right time whereby we should go for debt restructuring, also dealing with opening opposition's claim there on China being bad and proving why the outcome is just worse in the long term on their side. Before I move on to opening opposition more comprehensively, I will take opening.
Your main extension is a global deflationary environment, which is symmetric on both sides. If anything, your analysis proves why IMF bailout this time uniquely will be able to solve the systemic problem, given that the global environment is great for us.
Our extension proves why the IMF is incredibly likely to impose very harsh conditions on Pakistan that are likely to thwart its possibilities of long-term growth in a way that wouldn't be on the comparative, because this time debt restructuring is likely to work for Pakistan because of the broader global environment. Let's deal then with opening opposition. They claim that the IMF is very good because it knows that Pakistan is at fault, because it has a principal duty, because other countries want to engage in this bailout because they have the opportunity to increase their influence in Pakistan and neighboring countries have favorable deals. Let's deal with all of these mechanisms. The first thing to note is that I think Pakistan probably was partially at fault for the reason why they kept defaulting and have had to keep going to get to the IMF. And this is quite crucial because funds that came from previous IMF bailouts just went into the pockets of the military leaders that DLO themselves talk about, who have locked up opposition leaders and who haven't implemented any structural and systemic reforms to actually help people on the ground. And notably on our side, we can flip this and actually claim why we are likely to change those leaders. And that's because it's more technocratic leaders who are able to negotiate the quite complex debt restructuring better, who are likely to rise to the top of the political spectrum in Pakistan. And we are more able, therefore, to solve structural issues rather than just keeping the leaders who predicate their power on the ability to receive these huge flows of cash from the Western world and are able to therefore not actually deal with the underlying problems that mean that Pakistan needs to keep on taking this debt out over and over again. And this note also solves the problem that DLO identifies about the populist policies that just rely on receiving that short-term influx of cash. And DLO says that governments can now spend on welfare, but you need to have governments who are willing to do this in the first place, which we can get on our side. But secondly, I think that the other countries they talk about, such as India, really don't want this to happen. And that's because these are the countries that are funding the bailout. And this explains why uniquely these policies are going to be really stringent, because these countries don't want to give up all their money to Pakistan. On the comparative then, they claim that China can't afford these generous restructuring deals and that it faces other priorities. A number of responses here. Firstly, because of the fact that you have got the threat as Pakistan of turning to the IMF, that's why China does want to engage in this restructuring. Because if you turn to the IMF is going to say you can take no further loans from China. And that is what is even worse from China, meaning that we take China when it is at its most vulnerable and ensure that it adheres to these deals. But secondly, I think China has an incentive to encourage more and more countries to take out loans from it. And Pakistan is the way it can show on the global stage that to the countries where it is trying to expand the BRI, such as Argentina, that debt restructuring is popular, that it is better than the IMF. And these are countries that IMF has turned away from, meaning that China has the incentive, the soft power incentive, to expand its soft power. And for that reason, we provide far more compelling incentives as to why China is more likely to engage in these deals. For all these reasons, proud to stand in CG.
Thank you, Gavweb, for that great speech. We will now take the last speaker of the round.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
All right. I'll take POIs in the chat, please. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So let me get this straight. You're going to go to the IMF and you're going to be like, if you say, I need a further bailout because I haven't been able to pay you back all of these years and I just need more money, they're going to impose really, really shit conditions on you and going to be really, really tough on you. Maybe, let's say, let me buy that. But compare that. You're going to go back to the IMF or all of your creditors, China, Saudi Arabia, IMF, and you're going to say, hey, I haven't been able to pay back. I can't pay you back. Actually, the loans conditions that I agreed with you so many years ago, I actually want to renegotiate that. And suddenly, and by some magic hand, they're going to be like, oh yeah, here's some really great conditions. And this time we're going to be really lenient on you. I don't understand where the mech here is. What is the difference here is? No government bench is able to explain why restructuring is necessarily a more positive outcome to any given creditor, because the underlying condition still is I can't pay you back and I haven't done any policy changes to be able to pay you back completely or properly or in the entirety of this time. Therefore, you're in almost always you're going to end up with austerity or stringent conditions or anything that the other creditor necessarily imposes upon you. We repeatedly asked this from the gov bench from the opening and also from the closing through POIs, and then Daniel's extension asked this and they completely ignored. They just pretend that this is not going to happen while give us no analytical reason as to why this wouldn't or why this would necessarily. Notice that our extension, our analysis is completely independent on that. We don't care in a world where conditions are shit or good on either side of the world. We think just a cash bailout is what is needed and you're going to end up better off. Why is CG out of this debate? In addition to what I've already said, the kind of policies that they said, oh, when we restructure our debt, we can focus on protectionism and we can in the long term improve Pakistan. This relies on Pakistan, the internal mechanisms or the condition or the operations of Pakistan being such that they're able to do this. Protectionism is just a throw around word. They've not really explained why this will work in Pakistan. I'll tell you why that's not going to work. Pakistan does not have any significant high industry of its own. It relies heavily on imported oil, machinery, capital, and all of that. If you impose a protectionist sort of economy, you can't import parts and manufacturing equipment and oil and all of the necessary things to actually build something, while Pakistan doesn't necessarily manufacture anything. So therefore, it is unconvincing to the fact that you're suddenly going to prop up your industry overnight when you haven't been able to do so for the past 70 years. The only thing that exists in Pakistan is the security apparatus and the security state, which both government benches agree that the military has dominated Pakistan over time, has sort of siphoned money towards their side. And in the context of the massive security threats and situations that Pakistan faces, it's unbelievable. It's difficult to understand that why any sort of restructuring or any sort of changes will suddenly change the military structure or militaristic nature of the state itself. Therefore, these policies are not going to work. The other thing that CG and the OG also offer is somehow this magic of foreign direct investment and more investment coming in. So this is where our extension becomes even more important. You know what? For foreign direct investment or any sort of investment to come in, investors want to see that they can make a gain out of this. One of the most key aspects of being able to make a gain is to see stability in the economy. Iran, for example, is an extremely wealthy nation in the sense that they have a lot of oil reserve, but there's not a lot of FDI going in, even during the short period when they did not have sanctions. Why? Because there's not a lot of stability in the nation, and there's a lot of risk associated with putting your investment there when you think that this country is not going consistent in terms of policy, or this country is generally not safe security wise. Pakistan is currently engaged in ongoing conflicts with India on its border. Pakistan also has a tense border with Iran, which is now engaged in another war with Israel, probably. Pakistan continues to engage in conflict with Afghanistan, which is now run by the Taliban. Pakistan also has this significant nuclear security apparatus of themselves. They need money to be able to sustain any of that, in addition to the domestic threats of terrorism that exist within Pakistan. Now you take away money from their place and you restructure with the IMF, China, with everything. And even if you close your eyes for 2 minutes and be like, you get the best deal on the face of this earth, which is restructuring or amazing deals, we don't necessarily think without immediate cash, you're necessarily able to create or sustain a stable environment or stable security situation in your country to be able to keep going. Now, the only answer that CG brings is that, the global interest rates are going down, and suddenly you can get credit really, really easily. If you can get credit really, really easily on brilliant conditions, why not just go and get that? Why go ahead and damage your credit ratings, then renegotiate, sit down with China and IMF and go back later? And I said the chat. To do that, I don't understand why one is mutually exclusive to the other. But B, the global environment is actually not really conducive to borrowing at the moment. Oil prices are not very high. Saudi Arabia has increased oil production at this point in time. And therefore, and also with the onset of increased war right now with Israel and in the Middle East, we think the security or the tenuousness of the entire region is increased. Therefore, we find it tough that anyone would be willing to just randomly give throwaways in this context, in Gov's own contextualization, which says that Pakistan is not a very good borrower. Second, our discussion on Pakistan being cash-strapped, which I just talked a bit about from a security context as well, but also in terms of expenditure context as well, as Pakistan needs to sustain its public sector, which is what sustains the majority of people in Pakistan and welfare in Pakistan. You don't want to leave people out to dry. Opening. POI.
So our second argument wasn't more investors, it's retaining investors. If you take yet another bailout, they have to leave because they think you can't be trusted to fulfill any debt, versus if you give some guarantee. So if the problem is you need money now, this is just far more immediate than CO.
So this argument is reliant on the signaling mechanism that you can't pay back debt. If you go and try to restructure debt, it also signals the same, or you can't pay back debt. Which brings me on to this other thing, this entire analysis on the Gov bench, that at some point, maybe this time, we will somehow win, and this restructuring will be the last one. And at some point, IMF will stop giving you bailouts. No, that's not true. Since the 1950s, the IMF has given you 25 bailouts. Saudi Arabia has given you money. China has given you money. They keep giving you money. You keep fucking it up. You're not changing your policies. You're unable to pay it back, but they keep giving you more and more money. And this Christmas does not end for you. Why is this true? Largely because of Pakistan's strategic advantage, and because Pakistan has nuclear weapons, and it's a very, very security tenuous situation where none of these actors want Pakistan to go into collapse and sort of break down. Therefore, they keep giving you money. So what is the trade-off? Just keep taking their money and keep sustaining yourself. There's no way you can prove policy changes to become a magically strong economy, but just take the money and do not collapse. That's why we win.
Thank you, Upweb, for that great speech. Thank you, everyone, for a great debate.